Thank you very much for being here. My name is John Rochelles. I have the honor of being the chairman of the Oklahoma City National Memorial and Museum, and I want to really thank you for being here tonight. And we have a very special guest here tonight. As you all know, we have an award-winning journalist, Anthony Shadid, who we're so happy to have here to listen to his story. And I think you're going to hear a very interesting account of what it's like to be in some of the really hot spots of the world that he has chosen to go to report from, so that the rest of us can know what is occurring in the world and learn a lot about those areas that we would not otherwise know. So thank you for being here. Before we get started, I'd really like to thank the Ethics and Excellence in Journalism Foundation. That's a bit of a mouthful, sorry. And Bill and Lil Ross, thank you so much for sponsoring this. What you're going to hear today is from a journalist whose roots started right here in Oklahoma City, grew up in Oklahoma City, went to Heritage Hall, spent a year at the University of Oklahoma before transferring to the University of Wisconsin. And your team had a great year last year, but I hope there's still a soft spot in your heart for the Sooners,
Absolutely.
Anthony. Good deal. And he's currently the bureau chief, the Beirut bureau chief for the New York Times, a great newspaper that all of you are very familiar with. He's previously had other postings in the Middle East. He's reported from a number of countries across the Middle East, Syria and Palestine, and Israel and Iraq and a number of others. So he's really had a tremendous degree of experience in an area of the world that always has been, and today is even more newsworthy than it ever has. Anthony has won 2 Pulitzer Prizes. That's pretty unusual. Congratulations for that. And if I'm right, I think you were a finalist a third time for your work in the Lebanon-Israeli conflict of when was that, 2007, I believe? So he's certainly got tremendous credentials. He's got a wonderful way of putting faces to the victims of terrorism, and that's what we all are here to understand, and something that really fits with the mission of the Oklahoma City National Memorial and Museum. Anthony is joined here tonight by his wife, Nida, and also by his children, Layla, and that little good-looking guy, 1-year-old, Malik. And he's also joined by his father, Buddy, and his wife, Shira, and a number of other family members. So thank you for being here, and let's give them all a nice, warm round of applause. As many of you may know, Anthony was here not long ago, actually on February the 26th. He spoke here as part of our education program to a number of educators in the city, and that was a scant 2 weeks before he went missing in eastern Libya, covering the uprising against Colonel Muammar Qaddafi. And he and 3 of his colleagues, another reporter and videographer, I think, and 2 photographers went missing, and it didn't take long for word to get out and thoughts and prayers to travel around the world and across the country, and certainly through the city of Oklahoma City. And thankfully, 5 long days later, Anthony and his colleagues were released by the Libyan government. So we're all very thankful of that. And you're going to hear a lot now tonight from Anthony about what that was all about and some of the things that he went through. We're webcasting this today as well, so that we can share Anthony's story with other people that can't be here around the world. You'll have a chance to ask some questions. There are cards on your chairs, so if you can just fill out your questions and pass them to the outside aisles. Carrie Watkins, our executive director, will make sure that they get picked up and that we have the opportunity to ask a number of your questions. I think you'll find this a very, very interesting afternoon or evening, and we're so thankful, Anthony, to have you here. And without further ado, let's give a nice, warm Oklahoma homecoming to Anthony Shadid.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Well, thank you for that introduction, and I just want to almost get emotional. I think I'm going to grab that water real quick. So. It was just so moving to see how people in Oklahoma responded to this ordeal, their prayers. It's something I never expected, and when I get through this part, it'll be easier. I say, when you worry about not coming home, home becomes a lot more important. So, anyway, I do want to thank everyone turning out here. There's a lot of friends and family. I want to thank the Lebanese community, who I see a lot of members here, and they've just been so wonderful. My family, of course, my father, my stepmother, my aunts and uncles and cousins are here. Of course, my lovely wife and my daughter, my son. I want to thank the Oklahoma City Memorial, who I've enjoyed my relationship with them for so long, and the foundation for making this possible tonight. I want to make a special thanks to Lynn Roller, who was my teacher in high school and has remained a great friend and a source of support until today, and I feel very, very lucky to count her as a friend. And I want to thank the people of Oklahoma, because as I said in the beginning, you really do realize you are from somewhere when you see this outpouring of prayers, of support, of goodwill. And I have to say, when we got out of our ordeal, we felt very undeserving, and I still feel undeserving. But I also feel very deeply, deeply grateful for everything everyone has done, and everything from the hundreds of emails to the calls to the like I said earlier, the prayers, and it means a lot to me. I have to say, I think I can claim to have made some pretty bad decisions over the past couple of months, and I thought that might be the framework for the talk, or just for the conversation about what happened tonight. And again, as a journalist, it's always tough for me to talk about myself. I'm used to reporting about other people and talking about other people's lives, and so I thought to make it maybe a little more interesting, I was going to talk not only about what happened to me in this ordeal, but perhaps also how it sheds light on this greater story, this unbelievable story that we're witnessing in the Arab world right now in the Middle East. And I think there were a lot of, in some ways, parallels and intersections between what happened in Libya to us and what is happening in the broader region. And I guess I'll start with the bad decisions. And I think the bad decision that led me to this ordeal that I had to go through started with a conversation I was having with my father the night before. In Benghazi. My dad is, as a loving father always does, was saying it might be time to get out of there. It looks like it's getting bad. And I, of course, maybe a little bit arrogantly, perhaps with a little bit of conceit, said, "You don't have to worry about this, Dad. I know what I'm doing. I've been in these situations before, and I'll be able to get out of it." And so the next day I went back, and it's a decision that I've had to make a lot of times as a journalist, and that's going to places that maybe I shouldn't be. In 2002, I was in Ramallah when I was shot by an Israeli sniper in the back and almost killed. In 2003, I was in Baghdad, unembedded during the American invasion. In 2006, I had to make decisions to stay in Lebanon during the Israeli attack on that country. And here's another decision. Each time I made those decisions, and I'm not trying to bring any glory to those by any means, but I often ask myself, why was I making those decisions? And I guess I felt at some level that if I wasn't there to tell the story wouldn't be told. And I hope that's the case. I hope it's not about ambition. I hope it's not about something a little bit more crass. I hope it is about something altruistic, that we do something as journalists that is important, that we bear witness, that if we're not there, then people aren't going to know what's happening. I felt that way in Baghdad. I felt that way in other places, and I guess I felt that way in Ajdabiya. This town that probably doesn't really mean a lot to anyone. It's not. I never knew the name before I got there, but I guess I felt there that next morning after talking to my father that there was going to be a decisive battle there, a momentous battle, and however that battle went between the rebels and Colonel Qaddafi's government would decide how this uprising played out, and that was the decision I made, was to go back. That next morning with Steve Farrell, the videographer. We met two photographers who I had been working with covering this front line for a few days. We met back at the hospital that morning. And, we do what we do as reporters in situations like this. You talk, doctors always, have the best sense of things. You talk to the doctors there. You try to find patients. We interviewed residents in the city for the afternoon. We went to the front line and talked to fighters. We came back. And I think at a certain point, something I've had to reflect on the past couple of weeks is, when did I have enough for the story? And I think I had enough for the story long before, but something kept me there. And I think that's what I'm wrestling with right now, is what kept me there. Why did I stay there longer than I should have? It was another one of these bad decisions I've been talking about. But we did stay too long. And we stayed too long after getting warnings. And, in all fairness, two of my colleagues, Steve Farrell and Lindsay Adario, photographer, both said we should have left earlier. And it was, and I and Tyler Hicks, the other photographer, said, insisted that we stay longer. And so I think the decision does fall to both of us. And, to be honest, I think it falls to me even more perhaps, because I think if I had spoken up, we would have maybe left earlier. By 4 o'clock, we had heard that Colonel Qaddafi's soldiers had entered the town. We thought, and we've been covering these battles for, like I said, for a few days, where they were coming from the west. The soldiers would come from the west, there would be a front, the fighting would last for a day, 2 days, 3 days, and then the rebels would flee backwards. And we were under the impression that was going to happen again in this town of Ajdabia. What happened instead was it was encircled. Troops encircled, Colonel Qaddafi's soldiers encircled the town. So as we finally made the decision to leave, within what felt like minutes, but it was probably just seconds, we hit this checkpoint. I saw a group of people, and as a journalist, as a reporter, like, well, there's a group of people there, this might be interesting. So I was like, we should maybe check this out. A couple of seconds later, another bad decision. A couple of seconds later, Lindsay Adario, the photographer, said, I think these are government soldiers. We shook our heads. And again, I think in any people that have gone through a car wreck or, anything like this, you have these events that play out in slow motion, and this one certainly did. It felt like it lasted minutes, but again, I think it was seconds. It was just about 50 yards away. And we hit this checkpoint, and you have that slow kind of realization that this is really bad. I looked at these soldiers, and I said, these aren't rebels. They're all in uniform. The rebels we've been covering had been driving pickup trucks. These guys were in military vehicles. And all of us, all of us realized it, I think, at the same point, although Lindsay saw it before. Tyler yelled, go, just drive through the checkpoint. The driver, again, in Mohammed Shatlouf, shouted out journalists, and Steve, my colleague, the videographer, said, don't say that, don't say that. And then we made it through the first line of soldiers, and then the second line saw Tyler in the front seat and realized that we were foreigners. They pulled us out of the car. All 4 of us were pulled out from the right-hand side of the car, and the driver went out the left-hand side. And again, like these moments that seemed to last, for minutes and minutes, really it was just seconds, rebels attacked the checkpoint. The same rebels that we've been working with and covering and talking to attacked the checkpoint, and I'm not sure what the motivation was, if they thought they were trying to help us, they thought this was a moment of weakness for the government troops, but a gun battle erupted unlike anything we'd ever seen, and we've covered conflicts, all 4 of us had covered conflicts before. You could see the bullet impacts in the ground as the dust was flying, and we basically ran for our lives. People were slapping us, and we just didn't care. And Tyler was the first one to make a run for it. And then I followed him. I fell on the ground on a sand berm, and I got to my feet. And the whole time, I don't know if people have read Homage to Catalonia. It's a book by George Orwell, who covered the Spanish Civil War. But Orwell makes this point that it wasn't the fear of getting shot; it was the fear of where the bullet would enter. And I definitely felt that as I was running away. I was waiting for to be shot in the back or something in my leg, and you were just wondering where it was going to hit as you're running for your life. Lindsay followed me, and then Steve, and we all went behind a concrete shack. Tyler had told me later that he was about to make a run for it and try to escape, but I think that would have been a disaster. I probably would have followed him at that point. You're just kind of running on instinct. But we got to this concrete shack, and we were we were beaten. Our pockets were emptied. Somebody found, I had $8,000 in my bag. This guy probably thought he arrived in Vegas. But emptied all this stuff, computers, everything, and they put us on our knees. And at one point they said, they were speaking in Arabic, and they said to get on your stomachs, and they started forcing us on our stomachs. And I think that was the moment, to me, when I look back, when you have trouble sleeping at night, that's the moment I think back to, is when you think you're going to be put on your stomach, you're expecting to be shot in the head. You're expecting to be executed. And we all resisted that. One colleague, Steve Farrell, who's been a veteran of this stuff, he was kidnapped in Afghanistan, insisted on keeping eye contact with the soldiers. I was trying to say a few things in Arabic, but speaking in Arabic was getting me more in trouble because they thought I was a spy or a translator. They called me, they said, "You're the translator, you're the spy." And so I tried to speak with as heavy an accent as I could, as broken Arabic as possible. And then I looked up at this one soldier, and they finally did force us on our stomach, and I looked up at this soldier, and he said in Arabic, "Shoot them." And then again, it felt like minutes, but it was probably just a few seconds. Someone else said, "You can't, they're Americans." And they didn't. And I have to say, there's a feeling, I've only had it twice in my life, but there's a feeling when I was shot in Ramallah, and this happened in Libya, in Ajdabiya, where you fear you're about to die. And it's not, I don't know, I'm sure people have had near-death experiences here, but it was never frantic, it was never, you never felt like getting up and trying to run away, save your life. Instead, it's kind of just a weird resignation, just an acceptance. And yeah, it's a tough feeling. And I think that's been the most difficult thing to deal with is, how do you make life meaningful enough to justify that? So that was the beginning of a night that felt like it went on forever. I think I wrote in the story that I had to do for the New York Times later on that we probably should have died that night. Every couple of hours, the rebels attacked this checkpoint again, and we're sitting there bound, and our legs are bound, our hands are bound. And every time these gun battles start, we just barrel out of the car and just kind of fall to the ground. And this happened time and again. And I want to get to this point later. We were beaten for a while. People were being tough on us, but at other times people were being generous. And somebody came up to me and gave me water, and he fed me dates. I couldn't eat because my hands were bound. But it was a kind of a pattern that I think would emerge more and more, was this, this ferocity in the beginning, and then, a little bit more generosity and hospitality as you became more human in their eyes as time went on. The next day we were piled in a car, and we were driven to a town called Sirte, which is Colonel Qaddafi's hometown. So that first 12 hours, I remember telling Tyler this. I said, if we can make it through this night, we're going to be okay. They're going to pass us up the food chain. Somebody will know who we are. Somebody will help us out. We just have to get through this night. And we did get through this night. And, I hesitate to speak on Lindsay's behalf, a photographer, very brave photographer. But, Lindsay not only had the beatings that we as men dealt with, but she also had, the kind of like the sexualized violence that she had to put up with, the groping that went on all night. And, we could, as we were being driven to a checkpoint in a tank, I could hear her crying out. And we were all pretty helpless at that point because we were blindfolded and handcuffed, although our legs weren't tied at that point. It reminded me as we were put in this pickup, and we were kind of put in the back of the pickup, you couldn't see anything, that, I'd covered Baghdad I'd been in Iraq for 5 or 6 years. Countless times I'd seen people being bound and handcuffed, blindfolded. And I realized during that drive as they were taking us to Colonel Qaddafi's hometown that, I had covered that so many times a little too dispassionately. I never had understood the suffering of what that means to be handcuffed and blindfolded. It seemed like, more of a process than what I think it really is, which is disorienting and dehumanizing. And I think that dehumanization that almost anyone in power has to do before they commit violence against someone else, it became very vivid to me. I saw it firsthand. And when I go back to that point about we were treated better, it was only when we regained our humanity in their eyes were we treated better. I also thought, in a more major way, the wreckage of a state as we passed along that Mediterranean coast, going from Ajdabiya to Sirte. The Libyans that I met were incredibly brave, passionate people, and they were trying to create a new state, a new country. And they're running up against a government, run by Colonel Qaddafi, who had been, at least rhetorically dedicated to this idea of perpetual revolution, 4 decades of perpetual revolution. It was neither perpetual nor was it a revolution, and what he left in its wake was just, I keep using this phrase, the wreckage of a state, but it really wasn't even a state. And it was interesting to me as I talked to people before our ordeal, places like Beda or Derna, they weren't trying to navigate the transition to a new government. They were trying to build a state from scratch. They had nothing to build on at this point. And one of them put it to me very, very eloquently, I thought. He said it was managed chaos for 40 years. And I think that's one of the things that's going to be very difficult going forward, for Libya, is that there's going to be a reckoning with this chaos that Colonel Qaddafi has left behind. And that's why I'm a little bit probably pessimistic. I'm very optimistic about the Arab world, but maybe a little bit pessimistic about where events are going to head in Libya. I think in some ways Libya is the dark side of these changes we've seen in the Arab world. I covered Egypt, and I have to say as a journalist, even as a person, it was the most exhilarating thing I'd ever seen, where 1 million people had gathered in Tahrir Square, dedicated not only to building a new state, to carrying out a revolution, but to building a society that they felt proud of. And that's very moving to see that happening. You went into Tahrir Square, and it was almost all of a sudden you had an imagined Cairo, an imagined community. This is what imagination can create. So it was from that epiphany, almost that euphoria that you felt in Egypt, to this kind of this misery of Libya and this desolation that Colonel Qaddafi left behind, and then kind of the chaos that we saw firsthand as they drove us to this town called Sirte. I think that was the lowest point of this whole ordeal. We were kept, I guess it was a total of 7 days actually, if you can count the day we were abducted and the day we were released. The lowest point was they put us in a jail cell in the basement. On these 4 dirty mattresses. There was graffiti on the walls, and ever the reporter, I was trying to remember the graffiti if I ever had to write about this. I was trying to record the conversations. And they called me upstairs because I was the only Arabic speaker. And they called us upstairs and left me there blindfolded. And there were, one guy said, and I thought very chilling when I thought back on it, he said, you could be shot and left on the side of the road and nobody would know, where you were, who you were. I don't know if he was saying that as a threatening or if he was saying it out of compassion. It could have been read either way. I thought about that quote for a long time, but I think more alarming to me at that moment was that, over a 30 or 45, I say interrogation, it was just questioning. Nobody mistreated us by any means at that time. It became very clear to me that he had no idea who we were, our names, where we were from, what the New York Times was. And when I went back to our jail cell that evening with my 3 colleagues, I told them, I said, we're lost. No one knows, no one knows who we are, and no one can do anything about us until they do. And that was definitely a low point, that kind of feeling very lonesome and alone. And I have to credit my colleagues, those 3 journalists were very different personalities, but Lindsay had a great sense of humor. Tyler was a great storyteller. Steve Farrell had a British education, which came in handy because he could quote anything everywhere. And I had the language that I think got us through this in some ways. But we kind of drew on each other during that, especially that low moment there where it seemed like we were going to be kept for months or even longer. And our fear at this, and this is why I think we were all so overwhelmed when we got out by this incredible reception that we received, we feared being forgotten. That was the tough period. Those first 3 days was the toughest, I think, on us. When we were put in that back of the pickup truck, every time we stopped somewhere at a new checkpoint, people would beat us. They'd slap us, beat us, yell bizarre things, like they just yell Libya. I never understood quite what that meant, but you started getting tense. Even though you're blindfolded, every time that car would draw to the brakes would be hit, you just started getting tense because you're preparing yourself for, to get beaten again. We finally made it to the next town. We were brought to a military airfield, and that, I guess, it was the worst of the beatings and also the end of the beatings in some ways. And I was hit in the back of the head with a rifle butt or a gun butt. I don't know if it was a pistol or a rifle. Tyler, everybody was treated pretty badly. We were handcuffed so bad that our hands went numb, and we were strapped into this military airplane. And again, I want to say, what I felt and what I experienced, there was nothing inherent in this culture by any means, the opposite. When we got on that military airplane, the kind of more thuggish guys that were dealing with us left, and the air crew was there. And they came up to all of us repeatedly and said, "We're sorry." They'd seen how we were treated, and they felt bad. And I think, again, I come back to this point again and again, as we became more human in their eyes, I think what we were dealt with was a culture that drew on its very inherent sense of generosity and hospitality. Arab culture is that way, and we definitely received it. We could have been treated much worse than we were, I think, to be honest. So this military flight took us to Tripoli, and that was kind of in some ways the end of our ordeal. We were treated much better once we arrived there, but I think our destinies were decided in some ways on that military airfield, on that tarmac in Tripoli, there was a fight. We were put in one, like, one of these big police wagons. There was kind of a funny moment there where, they were saying to me, they stood me up, we were still blindfolded, they said, down, 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 USA. I said, down, down, USA. And then they said this to my colleague, the British colleague, and he said, but I'm British. No, he said, he's half British, half Irish, and he said, but I'm Irish. And the guy looked at him, and I guess he looked at him, he said, down, down, Ireland. And my friend said, down, down, Ireland. So, but we were kept in this vehicle for about half an hour. We were moved into another vehicle, and there was a fight that was going on outside the tarmac. And what I gathered, it was a little bit distant, it was hard to hear. What I gathered, a fight was going on who was going to take custody of us, who was going to get us. And that fight lasted, I would say, about 30 minutes. And I gathered it from between the Interior Ministry, which we were very scared of. This is Mukhabarat, this is the intelligence services. That would not have been good. There was also, I think, the Defense Ministry involved, the Foreign Ministry, perhaps even one of Colonel Qaddafi's sons, and I think we were in his custody, to be honest, even from all the way from Ajdabia. In the end, the Defense Ministry got us, and there was just this, we were put into another vehicle, we were blindfolded, taken to a house, and we all four, it had just been a rough 3-4 days. I'm trying to think, I guess it would have been a full 3 days at that point, and we just sprawled on the carpet, and just, it was just at the end of our rope, and they fed us, of all things, or gave us a drink, milk and mango juice, and I think we got an apple or a banana, I forget now. It was just, you're almost delirious at that point. But somebody came in there and he spoke English, and he came in and he said, you'll never be mistreated again. And we weren't from that moment on. They were very insistent on finding out what happened to Lindsay. For some reason, they really wanted to know how much money was stolen from us. They promised that we might be blindfolded again as we were moved from place to place, but we would not be beaten anymore. And we hadn't really been fed until that point, and we would be fed again well. And I have to say, they kept their promise. They kept their word on all those. What happened after that, I think, was more a sense of, journalists, who loved to come up with the worst possible scenario, scaring each other. And we sat in there for 3 days and just scared each other. We of the crazy scenarios that might happen, that we're going to be hostages, because of the no-fly zone. We had not seen anything. I'd heard on Libyan state radio that Benghazi had fallen, so that's what I was thinking had happened. We heard gunfire, and we assumed that Ajdabia had fallen. They gave us 15 minutes to watch of CNN, and the very 15 minutes we watched of CNN, a story came out about 4 New York Times journalists missing. And so Lindsay was like, oh my God, people still don't know where we are. Our families must be just, distraught. And they saw how Lindsay reacted, and that was the last 15 minutes of CNN that we watched. They actually just cut the cable. It wasn't even pulling the plug out of the wall, it was cutting the cable with a knife. So then we were just kind of trying to, again, like I said, our imaginations ran wild, and we started hearing the anti-aircraft. We believe we were in Colonel Qaddafi's compound, Bab al-Azaziyah. And I think the second night we were there, we started hearing the anti-aircraft fire. We heard the bombing. We were moved from place to place. And in this process that followed in our release was really, as harrowing as I think we feared, that we were going to be hostages, that we were going to be kept for months until, somebody could make use of us. What in the end was basically a diplomatic dispute. And they had to figure out how to deport us. It kind of came down to that. And it was really remarkable to me as I saw that process unfold. I had been in Baghdad in 2003 as another government was falling. And it was the same kind of dynamic that you saw in Tripoli in 2011. And that was, the more the state crumbled, the more the people loyal to that state tried to show its prestige, tried to show that it was still a state, that it was still legitimate. And we met that at almost every interview we had from then on with the Foreign Ministry, that, in Arabic they were saying, you're in the protection of the state is legitimate. And I think that very idea of keeping the state legitimate, or proving that the state was legitimate, was why we were released as soon as we were, and why we were treated so humanely once we were in the hands of them in Tripoli. They wanted to show that they weren't outlaws. They wanted to show that they still deserved recognition and respect. And I'm not saying that they do, by any means, but I'm saying that thinking that they were dealing with, I think, hastened our release, very much so. We basically waited it out in this guest house. And this guest house was, I kind of referred to it as, in the New York Times story, as kind of like a double-wide trailer, but it had with metal bars on the windows, and a warning that if we dared look out the window, we were going to be, hogtied, as he put it, and not treated very well. So we didn't. There was 5 Shakespeare plays. Qaddafi was famous for having claimed that Shakespeare was in fact Sheikh Zubair. He was an Arab immigrant who ended up in Britain, and he's always had an affection for Shakespeare. So we, with nothing else to do, we all read Shakespeare. Tyler read Julius Caesar. I was reading Antony and Cleopatra. Steve had already read them twice, being British, so he just quoted lines from them the whole time. And then Lindsay finally picked up Othello, if I remember right. But we talked about the driver, and I think that's something that remains unresolved, and we're very worried about it. The last time we saw the driver was that moment at the gun battle, and we tried to replay in our heads what we had seen, what might have happened to him, where he might be, and I think we're all dealing with the burden of the possibility that someone's death may be on our hands, and I think decisions that we made that shouldn't have been made that may have ended up killing someone, and we're very hopeful still. We have 2 people that went back to Libya to try to find out what happened to him. We're in communication with his family. We're making requests with the Libyan government to find out, like I said, to find out his fate or his whereabouts. He was a beautiful young man, 21 years old, Mohammed Shatlouf, and he believed very much in what he was doing. He wanted to be a part of this coverage, of this bearing witness of testifying to what was going on this revolution, but he would have never risked his life for that, and we did risk his life for that. And then, like I said, we also sat there and talked about our fear of never leaving. It turned out later that when we got to the Turkish embassy, they had been told 4 times over those 2 days that we were going to be released, and each time we were not released. But the last night we were moved, we were shifted to another location, and again, it was even nicer than the one before. And we actually got to watch CNN again, so we kind of became fully up to date on what was happening around us. It was actually quite a night of bombing. It was, you never think it's going to end until it ends. When it did end, and I have to say the Turkish diplomats who got involved were very good. They brought us to the Turkish embassy. And someone asked me the other day when I was doing an interview about this, what was your feeling as you left? Were you euphoric? Was it? And it wasn't that. It was actually the opposite. And I think we all were pretty quiet as we left because we realized what we had done to our families and our friends and the people who love us. And they didn't deserve that. And I think we all felt a lot of guilt about that. I think we also, as it kind of went on longer, we felt undeserving about all the support that we received. People calling us brave, and I don't necessarily feel brave. I feel a little stupid right now, to be honest. But I think also first and foremost, it was probably a lesson in humility, and that that conversation that I had with my father should have gone differently. And I think the more we listen to each other, the more we listen to colleagues, the more we listen to our family and friends, the better off we are. I said in the beginning that these stories felt worth covering to me, that if I hadn't been in Baghdad in 2003, if I hadn't been in Lebanon in 2006, those stories wouldn't have been told. I'm not sure I feel that way about Ajdabia. I'm not sure I felt that story had to be told. I hope my motivation was altruism. I fear it was ambition. And if a young man had to die because of my own ambition, that's something I'm going to have to live with. I think I do feel a little more humble right now than I have in a long time. And I think the question that I'm asking myself is, not whether it's worth taking risks for a story, because I've always believed it is. I think the question I'm asking myself right now is what story has to be told and what story should be told, especially when someone else's life is in the balance. It was much easier after 2002 when I got shot in the back to lay in the street in Ramallah and realize that it might be over, thinking about, as you do, I think in those moments, the cliches, what's going to happen to my children and my wife. But now I have to come out of this situation and think about someone else's life and someone else's life that I bear direct responsibility for. And that's a very humbling thought.
I had just a few minutes to visit with them before, and if you will just kind of talk about how your family got the news and how they kept up to date on your whereabouts. I know we got the news from our friends in New York, and that call to Lynn was not a fun call to make because at the time we didn't know what would happen, and it seemed like forever for us. John said he'd just been here a couple weeks before and to a wonderful audience of educators and friends, and so we had heard your perspective just a couple weeks before that, and so your family, your dad and your wife and kids, share that story if you would.
You know, I have to say that was from the beginning. It's all we could talk about. I talked to my dad the night before, and there was no way any communication was going to be made. There was no way anybody would know what had happened to us or where we were. And we figured most of our family would have thought that we were killed at that moment. That's, that was just, it was an incredible burden. Burden's not the right word, but it was on our minds. The New York Times, I have to say, I've only worked for the New York Times for 2 years. I was at the Washington Post for a long time before that. The New York Times is a formidable institution, and I'm have a lot of gratitude for how it mobilized and what it did. And it quickly got in touch with our families. It got in touch with my parents, with Netta. It didn't know all that much, and there's not all that much it could know. It turned out in the end that Netta's father worked the phones for 6 hours after getting one random number in Ishdabi, and was able to track down somebody who knew what had happened. And he determined that we were probably alive, to his credit, and he called the New York Times and told them about that. But it was that number then didn't work afterwards. So then it was a process of just the New York Times updating people as much as they could, of calling Netta, calling family. And then on the fourth day, I want to say, after we saw this CNN story that, and Lindsay was so upset, they actually let us make a call. So I was able to call Netta. Someone was able to call the desk, or the foreign desk. Other people called their relatives. And I think Netta at that point had heard. But I am a journalist, and I believe in journalism. I do believe in what I do. I've seen a lot of colleagues who've been damaged by what we see. I think I think in the very easiest, I think the most minor thing that happens to you is that when you cover these events time after time, your eyes get calloused and you become too insensitive to what you see around you. You lose touch with the humanity of what's going on in the world. I've seen a lot worse cases where people get post-traumatic stress and they're not right again after that. I think that often happens to people who cover conflict as conflict. War photographers are, I think, a case of this, or even war correspondents. I would never call myself a war correspondent, the opposite. I actually cringe at the term. I cover conflict because it's a part of a region that I deeply care about, the Arab world. And if conflict is part of that change, a part of that reality of what's going on in the Arab world, then I feel like it's incumbent upon me to try to bring meaning to it and try to bring understanding to it. What I'm wrestling with right now, though, is whether that was my motivation in getting me where I was and in perhaps, endangering someone's life. And I don't know the answer to that. But I do want to continue covering the Arab world. We've been waiting for this moment for a generation. The moment when the Arab world is remaking itself, is refashioning itself, in some ways is being reborn. And I do want to be a part of that, and I do want to keep covering that. I got into journalism because I didn't like how people wrote about the Middle East, so I probably should keep covering it, as long as I can.
What advice do you have to young journalists interested in foreign reporting?
Well, it's a changing profession. The foreign correspondent that I've worked as for 15 years, I'm the last of my generation. I mean, this traditional foreign correspondent won't be around anymore. There's only a handful of newspapers who can support it. The millions of dollars you have to spend in Baghdad, the $50,000 satellite phone bills, it's a very expensive proposition. So I think things are changing pretty radically and dramatically, and I think the biggest newspapers will always have foreign correspondents. The wire services like the AP and Reuters always will. But I think what we're going to see is a much younger generation, more dynamic, in some ways more mobile, is getting funding from foundations and money from elsewhere, and there's going to be a lot more means and a lot more outlets for their reporting and their writing, and we already see that. I mean, I hardly ever read my colleagues' news stories anymore. I'm on Twitter, or I'm reading blogs, and it's 15 years ago you could actually read pretty much everything that was being written about the Middle East journalistically. Today you can't even scratch the surface.
What would bring peace in the Middle East?
Well, I think peace in the Middle East is coming. I have to say, I'm optimistic. I think what we saw in Egypt and Tunisia is some of the most breathtaking events in the Arab world since World War I. I think it's going to force Israel to make peace. I think we're going to see a healthier Arab world, an Arab world where governments reflect the aspirations of their people, where people are citizens and not subjects, and their rights are enshrined in law. And I think that is coming. I think it's going to be tough. I think what we saw in Egypt and Tunisia were the easy steps. I think what we're seeing in Libya is in some ways what we're going to see in the years ahead. It's going to be tough. There's going to be tragedies, there's going to be conflict, and there's going to be bloodshed. It's not going to be an easy path ahead, but the trajectory is right. And you can't put the, I mean, it's, you know, I'm going to use a cliche here, which an editor would kill me, but you can't put the genie back in the bottle at this point. Syria will never be the same again. Egypt will never be the same again, nor will Libya. And although there is going to be a lot of violence, you know, as we move forward, in the end, things are going to turn out all right.
Anthony, is the USA considered a weak country in the Middle East?
You know what was so fascinating to me about covering Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya, I tell you, Libya's a little bit of a, it's hard to draw generalizations out of Libya, but what was so remarkable to me about Egypt is when you're sitting in Tahrir Square, you know, I've covered demonstrations, you know, since, I mean, as a college student, I was there for the first Intifada in Palestine. I've been covering demonstrations forever, and they've often become cliched, boring in some ways. You know, it's the same thing about Israel and the United States and this and that. What was so interesting about Tahrir Square was an utterly new language, an indigenous vocabulary, people taking control over their lives and determining what kind of society they wanted to build. So it wasn't about Israel, it wasn't about America, it was about what Egypt is going to look like. And what, you know, you've got a government there in Egypt, or you had a government who basically hated its own people. I mean, it was really that visceral. And there were people in Tahrir Square who were going to prove that they deserved, that they were better people than their government had portrayed them as. And that was an amazing, so the slogans were amazing. The slogans were about freedom and rights and constitutions and accountability and transparency. And that's not what I've seen before. And it was something that the United States was not all that part of. The United States was a sideshow in some ways to what these protests were going on in Egypt. And someone asked me, what should the U.S. do? And I said, it should do nothing at this point. The less it does, the less it gets involved, the less it intervenes, I think, in the Arab world, in the Middle East at this point, the better off the Arab world is. This is a narrative that's playing out on people's terms there. I think intervention in Libya could have unintended consequences. I think it could be dangerous. I don't think it's going well, and I don't think it's going to necessarily go well, because I don't think we understand what the rebels in the opposition really are. I don't think they have not coalesced into something that can be understood at this point or supported. You know, another person asked that same question about American intervention. My answer was, I don't see when American intervention in the Arab world has gone right. It didn't go right in Iraq in 2003. You know, it certainly didn't go right. It didn't go right even all the way back to 1958 in Lebanon, when it in some ways hastened the civil war in '75. So I think the best lesson, I mean, again, in that vein of humility, is that, you know, in some ways the farther we stay away, the better.
What role did the social media play in the uprisings in Egypt and then Libya? Can you talk a little bit about how that?
It played a role, and I don't want to underestimate it. It played a role in sometimes kind of a funny degree. You know, in Egypt, as the revolution was unfolding, Facebook, because, you know, people were planting stuff on Facebook, people saw it as counter-revolutionary. And so Twitter became the revolutionary kind of like means, and people really Twitter, you could almost chronicle the revolution. I think it may have been a little overstated, though, the social media. I don't want to underestimate it by any means. I think it had a huge impact on Egypt and Tunisia and elsewhere. But if somebody asked me what was the most, if we talk about media, information, technology, what was the most important force behind these revolutions, it was Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera basically started the revolution in Tunisia, and it can claim credit for it, and it's just remarkable. And I have to say, I live in awe of the courage of my Arab colleagues. As far as I know, 4 Jazeera journalists are still in captivity in Libya. One was executed, I think. Al Jazeera journalists were so scared in Egypt that they wouldn't leave Tahrir Square because they were afraid they were going to be beaten or killed or arrested. You know, Al Jazeera, governments in the Arab world hate it, and they hate it for the right reason, that Al Jazeera is basically like an agent of change in the Middle East. And I am in awe of it, I have to say. It is a news-gathering machine. Now, not that it doesn't make bad calls, not that it doesn't, you know, come under pressure and do wrong things, and it does that. But just, you know, as an institution and what it represents, I think the real story of what kind of impact it's had on the Arab world and the Middle East is yet to be told.
You said tonight you were optimistic about democracy in the Arab world. What do you think about Syria and the future of Lebanon? Yeah,
it's, you know, this is where there's a big, I don't want to get too academic here or anything, but there's a huge struggle that's going on in the Arab world and the Middle East right now that is unresolved. And that's a struggle over identity and how we see ourselves as Arabs. And I think Syria is going to be a test case of that in some ways. What we saw in Egypt was an idea that we're going to be citizens, first and foremost. And as citizens, we're going to have rights. And a government has to guarantee us those rights. What we're seeing in Syria, I think, is change is inevitable. Change is going to happen, and the government is eventually going to fall in Syria. What rises up, though, in place of that? Are people going to be able to create this notion of citizenship, of universal rights, of that we belong to a state, we belong to a government, and because of our belonging to that government, I mean, a very elemental thing, because we're citizens, we get rights. Or are people going to revert to more primordial identities, smaller identities? Are we Alawite? Are we Sunni Muslim? Are we Christian? Are we Kurd? That's the question, I think. And I think how that battle goes, and Syria is the test case of that in some ways, so is Bahrain, Yemen to a smaller degree, is going to determine how successful these revolutions and revolts and uprisings are. I am optimistic. I think it's going to go the right way. I think people are going to not go to the Iraq model in some ways, that we all become Sunnis or Shiites or Kurds, but instead go to the way of Egypt, that we're citizens first and foremost. If it does go that way, then Lebanon's going to change. Lebanon, I think, is mired in this notion of identifying itself in narrower terms. There's 18 religious and ethnic sects in Lebanon, and that is the first and foremost affiliation that you have. I think tragically, because Lebanon is such a dynamic place, such a beautiful place. It's a wonderful place to live, but I think tragically, because of the affiliations are so small, it stopped the country from being what it could be. If change happens in Syria, if it happens in Egypt, if it happens in elsewhere, I think it's going to happen in Lebanon as well. And again, I think what we're on the path toward is a far healthier Middle East and a far healthier Arab world. I think as these conflicts go on, as violence continues, as frustration mounts, then you get a certain radicalism, then you get a certain extremism, and you have that in a situation in Libya where a lot of people have a lot of guns, and they're often young men, which is pretty much the most dangerous thing in the world. That's my fear going forward. It's not the presence actually of militant Islamists, but I think, again, we have two models. We have this idea of Libya, protracted conflict, what are the implications for it? And then we have Egypt, where a growing democratic body politic that can probably incorporate more militant currents and manage them in some ways.
Why did you talk tonight about why you felt to be undeserving as a survivor?
I guess first and foremost because I made the wrong call. I made a call that after 15 years as a reporter, I should have not made. And I had enough for a story before 4:30. I had enough for a story by 2:30. And, why did I stay? Did I stay because, I thought, I could make the story better and more meaningful and more worthwhile, or did I stay because I wanted a better quote or a better interview, or did I stay to prove something to my colleagues, that I was tougher than they were? I don't know the answer, and I'm wrestling with that. And maybe I'll feel better about my choices or my motivations down the road, but I don't feel very good about them right now, and especially given the consequences of those decisions that I made. I don't feel very deserving of praise right now. And, in fact, I think when we got out, we all felt a little embarrassed about what we had done to not only the driver, but our families and our friends. And they say that guilt's a natural thing in these situations, but we had plenty of it.
Someone asked here, I'm sorting through this, many are the same. It seems you truly care about journalism and the people you report. It seems as most American news outlets don't care as much. Do you struggle to have your stories told by your management, or are they supportive?
I have to say, if I was probably starting out, it would be tougher, but after 15 years of doing it, and I won the Pulitzer because of the way I wrote these stories and I reported these stories, trying to keep the humanity at the center of them. I think my editors expect that in some ways now, but it's not always easy, and I think it's different at different newspapers. They have different priorities and a different way of seeing the story, of understanding the story. But I think coming out of this thing, I almost it reminded me that going back to my roots in some ways that keeping people at the center of the story is the most important thing. Understanding the humanity of these stories is the most important thing, and I think even when we try to do it time and again, we lose touch of that over the years, especially when you see it so often. I think one of the saddest thing to me, I think, past 5 years was when I was covering a bombing in Baghdad, and I was sitting in front of this building where somebody had blown themselves up and killed 7 people. And I was sitting there with my notebook trying to think, what makes this scene somehow distinct? What can I write down in my notebook that will, for a reader, make this different than the dozens or hundreds of other bombings that have happened in Baghdad? And coming to the realization that I couldn't. And I think a lot of people here, a lot of readers, I think people understand that they get deadened by this violence, that violence after violence, so much carnage makes us turn away in disgust. And I think it's incumbent upon us as journalists and as reporters is to keep the humanity there, to keep the meaning of what's actually happening so that we keep the people who read us engaged. I think there's a parallel to make in all this, the story that I told about us being treated better once we were humanized to our captors, I think goes for every conflict in the world. And that once we lose, conflict is only possible once you dehumanize the people that violence is imposed on. And it's an important lesson, I think.
Does the New York Times or any other media, do they safety train you before you go into these countries?
They do. It's actually required. I never did it for some reason.
Hello?
I have to say, when I was hired by the Washington Post, I was hired in January 2003, just a couple months, or I guess 3 months before the invasion of Iraq. And so the Washington Post at that time just gave me a one-way ticket and sent me to the Middle East. And so I never got it before then, and they thought, well, if he got through the invasion of Iraq, he's okay. And so 2006 happened, and it kept on going on and on. So I think at this point it didn't work. I think everybody has their own sense of danger and of how much danger is too great. And as I said, I'm fully aware that I did not make the right call in Ashdabia. And actually, my colleagues did. Steve and Lindsay did make the right call, and I do wish I had listened to them. But, as Tyler likes to point out, Tyler says that, you make those calls 1,000 times, and 999 times you're right, and we were wrong this time. But it's hard to put in that context right now.
This is from an American Libyan. I want to say thank you for your courage to convey the Libyan story. And I'm sorry for those things, the treatment. My question to you is, what do you think the role of the U.S. should be to resolve this crisis?
Well, again, I go back to that point that I think intervention is usually not a good thing. And I'll say that the reason I say that is because you always have unintended consequences from intervention. Be it that Hezbollah in Lebanon was created in 1982 after Israel invaded, be it that Al-Qaeda was never in Iraq before the American invasion, but it was afterwards. Be it what might emerge in Libya. We have a conflict that's far more protracted, far more violent, far unresolved. And that to me is the greatest danger, is protracted violent conflict and what happens in that context. Does intervention sometimes hasten that, deepen that? I think it does. I'm sure there are examples out here, and I'm sure people can argue against that. And I think there are valid counter-arguments. I don't want to speak with too much authority on this. Just my own experience in seeing this happen is that it's often dangerous when it does happen. Should we intervene in Rwanda to stop genocide there? It's hard to argue against that. So or Bosnia, for that matter. So I do see the counter-argument. I understand the motivations. I don't think people are wrong in arguing the converse. I just worry about the consequences of what happens when we do it. What can the United States do in Libya? I don't know the answer to that, to be honest. I don't know what we could do at this point.
One last question, so we keep it to the hour, and then he'll be around for a few minutes after. If you don't tell the story, who will?
Well, that is my question, and that was, that's what I hope was my motivation, because I think there is a certain altruism in that. But the question I said at the end, and that I'm haunted by a little bit, and that I'm wrestling with is, did that story need to be told? In hindsight, it didn't. Ashdabia changed hands 2 or 3 times after that day of battle. It wasn't the seminal moment that we thought it was going to be. It wasn't even a footnote to this war and this conflict. So I think the question I'm asking myself, as I go forward is rather than, who's going to tell the story if I don't, maybe, better understanding what stories need to be told in the first place.
Ladies and gentlemen, Anthony Shadid.
Thank you very much.